This is James Francis Peter Marsh, and I've got a question. Where were you on June the 25th, 1962? I'll tell you, it was a Monday. I was working in New York and also playing semi-pro baseball with the Portchester Stars, headed by Bruno Joffrey. But that was the day that America made a mistake. The government overstepped its bounds and poked its finger right in God's eye. Because on June 25th, 1962, they took prayer out of school. Most people thought it was a small thing, but the results of it were catastrophic. Because that year, right after that, America was judged. They began to do nuclear testing on Nevada site over and over. Christmas Island, they were exploding bombs and no concept of fallout. Also, that same month, Martin Luther King was jailed in Georgia, and Russia began to send nuclear missiles to Cuba with the threat behind their attitude of they're going to attack America. So the results of that were judgment, and no one knew it. And even the children and the high schoolers that sat in class were judged, and I'll mention that in a minute. But the following year, just about a year later, in June the 17th, 1963, that's a Monday, America poked its other finger in God's other eye. And that was taking Bible reading out of school. And it's too late for that now to repair that. The results also were damaging. Martin Luther King was jailed in Birmingham. And 5 months later, the President of the United States was assassinated, John F. Kennedy, November 22nd. And that changed the course of America because the floodgates were open. Those two doors opened up floodgates for the enemy to come through America. It was like removing two pillars out of the foundation that held America. And the results were shaking. Vietnam War, they began to send advisors to Vietnam, and it began escalating a war that lasted 12 years. 1964, we were fully into the war, and all the high school students, or not all of them, but many of the high school students and junior high ended up going to Vietnam, and resulting in 58,000 young people killed, as well as 150,000 wounded, not to mention the scores of thousands and thousands of veterans that came back from Vietnam and took their own life. 1968 followed by the worsening floodgate that was opened by those two decisions of the Supreme Court. April 4th, 1968, that was a Thursday, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis. And then a few months later, June the 6th, 1968, the president's brother, Bobby Kennedy, was assassinated. You might remember Rosie Greer tackled Sirhan. Sirhan threw him to the ground. He's in prison in California. And so the floodgates of immorality and unethics came to America, ended in things like 1969. You had the Woodstock, which changed the sexual mores of America. A younger generation listened to Timothy, what's his name? Timothy Leary, telling young people to tune in, turn on, and drop out. Just drop out of college and take LSD. And that man was crazy, but many of the young people listened to him. The following few years, January 22nd, 1973, the Supreme Court poked the third finger in God's eye. And that was passing the Roe versus Wade decision, which took the lives of scores, 57 million babies aborted. That's more than 16 states. That's 2,900 per day. Now listen, we submit to the government, but we don't always have to obey. And this is a terrible thing. You see, what started once was perversion of any sexual activity outside of marriage was considered perversion, even by the AMA, where people were sent and deemed mentally unstable if they performed sexual actions outside of marriage. It was considered perversion. But then the government after that began to tolerate it. And after that, further down sliding, they began to condone immorality. And now what we have is the government and people, the culture, celebrating immorality. So these spirits of the devil were released on America in the flood of filth that came. And many people were victims of that. You know, children that were molested. We have so many people that were affected by this immorality and spreading it, not to mention disease, but just the attitude that, well, if it feels good, do it. And that's what people, the attitude in America today is, hey, you don't tell me how to act sexually. I can do what I want. But God's very clear about it. He's holy and he's just. God says, I want you to be holy even as I am holy. He says, flee immorality. And I'm going to tell you some steps in closing. How to maintain a pure heart. That's why God gave us marriage. I have a wonderful wife, Susie, and I'm happily married. If you go to Romans 6, you can find a process. He says, don't you know that you are crucified with Christ? That you are dead and buried and raised with him? So know that as a truth. And consider it. He says, reckon yourselves also to be dead to sin. So if I went in a funeral home and I saw a dead body and I showed him some pornography, he wouldn't respond. Or if I tried to sell him cocaine, he wouldn't respond. Or if I held a bottle of alcohol, that dead body wouldn't respond. And that's the same thing that God says. Consider or reckon yourselves to be dead to sin, and yield your members to God as members of righteousness. So we know the truth that we're buried and dead with him, and we reckon it, and then we yield our members to God as holy vessels, and shun evil, flee youthful lusts. And then we obey him constantly, moment by moment. No one has conquered the flesh, but we can live moment by moment, yielding to Jesus Christ as our Lord and allowing him to live his life in and through us. And this is the solution. It's a moment by moment battle. And we can walk in victory and rejoice in the fact that he has made us holy. It's not my own righteousness. It's not my own holiness. It's his life living in me. He places Jesus Christ across my heart, and he tries to live his life in and through me. So know that you're buried with him and raised with him. Reckon yourselves dead to sin. Yield your members as members alive unto God for righteousness, and obey him moment by moment. I want to thank you for listening, and don't ever give up your fight for goodness, truth, and purity.